But welcome everybody, and welcome to the official launch of the UK results for PISA 2022 in collaboration with the OECD and sponsored by PISA. I'd like to thank everyone for being here, for our speakers today in particular, for Pearson, who has not only sponsored this event but also carried out the PISA assessments in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and also to all of the audience for being here, and we're hoping to have some good time for questions afterwards. As we begin, and as our speakers talk us through the results, I think this year in particular with PISA, there are two things to bear in mind which I'd ask people to try and keep separately but related in their forefronts of their minds as they listen. The first is that by looking at rankings between Britain and other countries in the world, between England and the other parts of the United Kingdom, we can learn important things about which school systems are working, which curriculums is working, are the 2010 reforms working? And that can tell us some very important things about whether we are doing the right things in our schools or not. But then also this year, uniquely, we have the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has affected many, many countries around the world. And in particular, in all the results, we can see the fallout of the tragic decision by many health authorities around the world, including in Britain, to keep schools closed for so long. I think those things are both important, but they are separate. And we should consider the implications of both of them in their respective arenas as we go forward. I hope you'll hear a lot about both of those things today, and without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Mr. Alfonso Echazarra, who is the representative from the OECD here today to present the results. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. So I'd like to thank Policy Exchange for organizing this event. I would like to thank Pearson for supporting this event. I will present PISA 2022 results and what they imply for the UK in particular. My name is Alfonso Echazarra. Thank you for spelling the name so nicely. I think even in Spain I never get my name correct. It's obviously Basque, but even Basque have some issues. So I'm going to present the results for the UK. I'm a co-author of the report, in particular Volume 2, which is related to policies. I've been working for PISA for the last 10 years. I've been involved in the initial reports in 2015, 18, and 22. Obviously, I'm kind of more knowledgeable about certain parts of the report, but I will try to do my best. So what is new in PISA? Well, we have more students than before. We have almost 700,000 students, 15-year-old students in 81 countries and economies. When we say 15-year-olds, actually is 15.3 until 16.2. It's just we refer to 15-year-olds to make it easier. We have newcomers: El Salvador, Jamaica, Mongolia, the Palestinian Authority, both Gaza and the West Bank, and Uzbekistan. So the core subject in PISA 2022 is mathematics, and the way we define mathematical literacy is the individual capacity to reason mathematically and to formulate, employ, and interpret mathematics to solve problems in a variety of real-world contexts. It includes concepts, procedures, facts, and tools to describe, explain, and predict phenomena. It assists individuals to know the role that mathematics plays in the world and to make the well-founded judgments and decisions needed by constructive, engaged, and reflective 21st century citizens. What is relevant about this definition is that actually it has an impact on the items that we designed for PISA. Not so much the last sentence, but the other sentence actually define and guide the design and selection of PISA items. So there are items that are concentrated on the formulate process of mathematics, others on the employ, others on the interpret and reasoning. There's also items for different contexts: society, science, work. So the definition is actually workable. There is a reason for this definition, and that's the way the items and the test is actually designed. So now in December we're publishing 2 volumes. So volume 1, which is basically results in reading, science, and maths, and equity. Volume 2 is more about policies, about COVID-19, about school climate, stratification, policies. It's about resources, and it's about governance. And in 2024, there will be creative thinking, there will be financial literacy, and student readiness for lifelong learning. So this is the initial message. So what has happened overall in terms of performance? So we have 3 subjects: mathematics, reading, and science. Up to 2018, what we were observing is a downward trend, but it was a very slight downward trend across OECD countries. And suddenly in 2022, we see a huge drop, in particular in mathematics and reading. So across the OECD, it's about 15 score points, which is actually a big number. It could be almost between half and 1 full year of school year. Now, this is good news and bad news. So the bad news is that there was a decrease in performance across many countries and education systems, and obviously it is likely that many of the students who actually suffer the pandemic will actually keep struggling or be a little bit below performance across their across their lives. So we need to make sure that actually these students can catch up. The positive message is that actually schooling matters, because imagine if there was no drop. The message would have been terrible. It's okay, it doesn't really matter if we go to school or we don't. And actually this message is, yes, school matters. Schools around the OECD and around PISA participating countries were actually doing a really good work. Sometimes we don't see it because we are comparing schools where education is kind of equivalent often. Because there's no differences or no large differences between schools, we believe actually schooling doesn't matter, but schooling actually matters. This is the trends, differences in different countries between 2018 and 2022. The positive message for the UK is that the decrease or the drop has actually been smaller than across OECD countries. Similar, no difference, particular difference in science, and similar to the OECD, and a similar drop in reading, but relatively small compared to mathematics in other countries. These are the results for the 4 countries' education systems in the United Kingdom. We see the gap between England and the rest of the education system kind of stabilizing or even growing a little bit since 2018. And England definitely above the other 3. This is a list of high-performing countries and education systems. It's just to show that the United Kingdom actually belongs to the group of countries where performance is actually above the OECD average. This is the results for maths, but it's true for reading and it's true for science. And you can see the countries where the performance is kind of equivalent to the United Kingdom. We know Singapore at the top, we have Macau, Chinese Taipei, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, Estonia at the top. As you probably know, PISA tends to classify students based on their level of proficiency. Level 2 is considered kind of the baseline where students have, from level 2 onwards, they're supposed to have the basic skills to thrive in today's society, modern economies, and digital technologies. And in the UK, we observe 1 out of 4 students is actually below baseline level, so they're considered low achievers in mathematics. The number might seem actually large, but it still is way below the OECD average. Obviously, the percentage of low achieving students has actually increased in most OECD countries since 2018. Also, in terms of when we combine equity and we combine performance, so the horizontal axis is equity. The more to the right, the more equitable an education system is. That means that the socioeconomic status of parents is not as associated with performance. And the vertical axis is mathematics performance, and the UK is exactly where you want the UK to be, which is in the quadrant where you have equitable outcomes and relatively high performance. And the United Kingdom is with countries that probably all education systems would like to be around, which is Canada, Korea, Japan, Denmark, Estonia, so on and so forth. So the big question of what happened with COVID-19. So what we've done is try to measure kind of resiliency in education systems based on 3 indicators: performance, equity, and well-being. Well-being measured by a sense of belonging to schools, how much they feel they belong to school. There was an option to use life satisfaction, but it's not so closely related to education. So we thought these 3 indicators were actually ideal. And we see the United Kingdom stands for being resilient in terms of equity. And we find the 4 countries that actually held best in terms of the 3 indicators are Japan, Korea, Lithuania, and Chinese Taipei. Well, this is a classical message in PISA, so it's the relationship between spending in education and spending in students and performance. This is kind of exactly the same result since 2000, so it's obviously a very stable and robust result, which is that the more you spend on education, the better the results, but only until a certain point. So you see a very strong relationship when you are actually a middle-income country, spending an additional dollar when you are Paraguay or Philippines. It usually makes a big difference. Once you reach certain level, which is $100,000 for the entire education of the theoretical duration of studies, the difference or the association is actually small, relatively small. And you can see the difference between, for instance, Singapore and Qatar, similar spending, but obviously Singapore scores much higher. Or you can see the same message at the left, at the lower end, with comparing Vietnam and Paraguay. But another key message, and I think this is quite relevant for the UK, is about learning time. It's not only about how well you perform, it's also about how much time students are actually spending learning, both in school and out of school. And I'm saying this because we often, and I know that this is the case in the UK, we often look a lot to East Asian countries, to Singapore in particular. But it's funny because in economics, we always think about productivity. We always think about not only about how much money we earn, we also think how much time we have to put to actually earn that money. In education, we don't look to that relationship so often. But here we see that countries like Singapore, for instance, if you combine homework and learning in school, we see they're actually spending almost 45 hours learning. But we see other countries like Switzerland, where it's just 30 hours. Obviously, the results are a little bit better in Singapore, but in terms of if we divide, we make the relation between time spent and results, maybe, depending on the education system, depending on the family, depending on the government, some countries would actually prefer being Switzerland than being Singapore. So that is a choice that countries and education systems have to make. I can guarantee that as a father, I prefer my kids spending less time studying than more, but this is a decision that everyone needs to make. Even if we included total learning time, if we included study time in addition to homework time, the relationship will be actually the same. So this is material resources, so how much principals are concerned about the material and the staff resources in schools. The results for the UK is interesting because principals are more concerned than the typical principal or the average principal in the OECD about the human resources at school. This doesn't mean that there is actually a lack of resources. It's actually the perception of the principal. But we don't see the same for material resources. So there is no particular concern in the UK about the material resources in schools. But this is the key message, that actually the resources that appear to matter most for performance in general are actually those related to teachers. These are results we know from from experiments, we know from the literature. If you look to the left-hand side, it's actually teachers, teaching staff. We see that there is a clear negative relationship. This is after controlling for socioeconomic profile. There is a clear negative relationship between shortage and of teaching staff and mathematics performance. But when we go to educational material, actually the results are no longer significant. So teaching staff is the most strongly associated. Then we have assisting staff. Then we have educational material. And when we go to infrastructure, or when we go to digital resources, we actually see no relationship. This is consistent with the literature. I mean, we know parents often, look a lot to infrastructure, but obviously, and the reason is it's so much difficult to measure the quality of teachers than the quality of the infrastructure. So we use the infrastructure as a sign of the quality of the teaching and the school environment. But obviously, teachers are the ones who are making the difference. This is a new message in PISA, new questions in PISA. Very interesting is how much students get distracted by using digital devices. The message for the UK is actually very positive, which is the UK students are the ones who, one of the students who are get less distracted or least distracted about using digital devices themselves, or they report getting distracted by other students using digital devices. And there is a reason for this. And here, if you see, is the time they spent actually on using digital devices in classes. And the UK stands out for using the internet or digital devices similar to the OECD for regular lessons, but students spend much less time using it for leisure at school. So this is probably what someone would like to see, using the internet for learning and not for leisure in school premises, on school premises. And this is an interesting result. Obviously, the more you use, so on the left, you see how much time, in how many lessons they're using digital devices in mathematics. Students get more distracted. That's why the bars are actually growing. They get more distracted, obviously, as they use more digital devices in class. Obviously, it makes sense. The results on the right are even more interesting. They are related to the policies. What are the school policies on the use of mobile phones? And this is a key question because today, schools are sometimes completely lost on what to do with mobile phones. We allow them, we don't allow them, we allow them, but only certain classes. So it's a very difficult question. What we see here is that, unfortunately, the only policy that is negatively related to distraction is banning mobile phones. Now, we don't want to, because this is not enough evidence to encourage a complete ban, obviously, of mobile phones in schools. But at least it makes us think that schools and families and teachers need to be very strategic about when, what, and for what, and for what purposes we're actually using mobile devices. So being smart about smartphones. Teaching and learning, we have something on teacher support. This is one of the key variables on teaching, how supportive teachers have been, particularly during COVID. And we see the UK students report a little bit less of teacher support than the typical or average student in the OECD. And this is relevant because we know teacher support is related to better performance after accounting for socioeconomic profile, and is also related to less mathematics anxiety. This is another interesting result, a new question in PISA. There is even a story behind. We wanted to ask students how, if there were days or if they were hungry, if there were days when they didn't have something to eat because of money. Many OECD countries, European countries in particular, say, no, we don't want to ask this question. This is not a problem in our country. This is something for middle-income countries. But actually, what we were encouraging them, because we said, well, even if it's very low, you're still concerned if it's 3 or 4 or 5%. I mean, it's probably a very small proportion of the population, but it can be a big issue for these 4, 5, 10%. And what we see in the UK is that 1 in 10 UK students reported that they did not eat at least once a week because there was not enough money to buy food. So it's actually a relatively large proportion for an OECD country, and I think it's something to think about. I mean, obviously these are student reports. We always have to bear in mind that this information comes from students, but it's incredibly relevant and it's very policy relevant because it's something that countries and government can do a lot to solve. Well, I know there's programs on school lunch, free school lunch, breakfast, and so on in the UK. What do we have about socioeconomic gap? Well, the message here for the UK is clear. Anything on equity is actually positive in the UK. I've been trying desperately to look to something negative on the UK on equity, and it's been so difficult. Everything looks really well in terms of equity. If you look at this graph, these are students organized by the decile of socioeconomic status. If you look to the lowest one in the UK, that's the second decile. We don't have the first because there's so few students. The lowest decile in the UK is actually performing pretty high. It's 440 points. That is above many countries, the average student in many countries. Actually, if you look to the distribution in the UK, it's actually quite compressed. Maybe you could argue there could be a little bit more relatively of top performers. But in terms of what is happening at the bottom, the message actually, or the message we get from PISA is actually very positive. Even the very low, the most disadvantaged students are actually performing quite decently in the UK. Obviously, it's impressive about if you go to Macau, China, the lowest ones are actually performing above the OECD average. Another positive message for the UK is the resilient students. So that means students who are at the bottom quarter of the socioeconomic status and are performing at the top quarter in mathematics. Usually the percentages are relatively low. At the OECD is around 10%, and the UK is almost 16%, 15-16%, which is actually a very high number. We've done a lot of work in terms of segregation, school segregation. This obviously is at the education system level, so it's not done for metropolitan areas, which is sometimes more relevant. But what we see in the UK is that the concentration or isolation of advantaged and disadvantaged students is close to the OECD average, a little bit lower than the OECD average. It's a little bit higher for advantaged students. That is typical. That is very typical of countries with a little bit more of private schooling, especially private independent schooling, because advantaged students use these type of schools to separate from the other students. But even then, actually, the percentage or the concentration is quite low or quite reasonable in the UK. This just to show that segregation, school segregation, not only matters because of peer effects, because of we want all students or disadvantaged students to be able to share class with average or even top performing students. It's also about social cohesion. And this is a graph showing the relationship on the horizontal axis. It's the concentration of advantaged students in schools. The vertical axis is generalized social trust, so how much we trust how much they agree with the statement, people can be trusted. And we see that in general, countries where the concentration of advantaged students is actually lower, we see more generalized social trust in that society. And the United Kingdom obviously stands out for having high general social trust and relatively low concentration of advantaged students. Gender gap in mathematics, well, more or less the same message as in previous cycles. Boys tend to outperform girls in a majority of countries, but in contrast with reading, where girls outperform boys in almost every education system except two, there are a number of countries where girls are actually outperforming boys. And this is a key message, because if we were looking at this 60 or 70 years ago, where many people actually believe that girls will never catch up, will never be able to be as good as boys in mathematics, so probably 70, probably 100 years. What we see in the results is that actually there are a number of countries where girls are actually outperforming boys. Typically Middle Eastern countries and sometimes also Northern European countries like Finland tend to get these results. In the UK, what we see is that boys outperform girls in mathematics. But more importantly, and this is another important message, is that in terms of top performing, top achieving students, we see that big difference between a big gender gap between boys and girls in mathematics. And that's because boys tend to be very spread across. So there's a lot of low achieving boys and a lot of high achieving boys. And girls are much more concentrated. That is, they look much more alike than boys do between themselves. So it's much easier to predict the results of a girl just by knowing that she's a girl than of a boy by the fact of being a boy. Students with an immigrant background, well, there's about 20% in the UK. It's actually grown a little bit in the last decade. Many of them are actually first-generation immigrants. But the positive message is that the UK is one of these few countries where actually students with an immigrant origin outperform those who are not immigrants once accounting for socioeconomic profile or language spoken at home. And actually, if we see the trends between 2018 and 2022, we see students with an immigrant background actually not, improving a little bit, but it's not significant. And we see non-immigrant students actually decreasing their performance by more than 10 points. So the message in terms of immigrant students is actually quite positive in the UK. Obviously, we know the composition of the immigrant population is changing constantly in the UK because there's newly arrived students and immigrants, so we're not really comparing exactly the same type of population. Obviously, non-immigrants remains much more the same. Immigrant students are changing constantly because there's obviously new migrants every cycle. This is a new result. This is something we haven't analyzed a lot, but I think it's relevant. People sometimes ask me, why don't you do anything about special needs in PISA? And the big question, the answer is here, is that this, if you see on the horizontal axis, is the percentage of students with special learning needs according to principles. Now, if you see on the left-hand side, there's actually probably 20, 30 education systems where the percentage of special learning needs is very, very small, even close to zero. Obviously, those are mostly middle-income countries. Now, the problem is that the definition, the thresholds, the means to identify special learning needs is so different across countries that there's no way we can actually compare results of special learning needs or even the context of special learning needs because they are the way they are defined, the way they are measured is so different. Now, the second message of this graph, and again, is quite positive for the UK, is how much they are actually spread across the education system or they're actually concentrated in a few schools. The more you are to the right of the line, the more spread out special learning needs are. So that's a positive message. And we see basically English-speaking countries. There's Australia, there's United States, the United Kingdom. When you are to the left-hand side of the line, what you see is a concentration because they probably have different policies of whether they are specialized schools or they're actually more inclusive schools. And on the left, you see, for instance, Slovak Republic, or you see Germany. Bullying. So I'm not going to report on the bullying results as we've done in 2015 and 18, but I'm going to report on a new, there is information on that, but I'm going to report on a new question on feeling safe at school. We're asking questions like whether they see fights, whether there are gangs, knives, guns, violence, threats in school. And what we see is that the UK students report a little bit more of feeling a little bit unsafer than the OECD average. Item by item, and this is relevant, what they actually say is that they are twice as likely to see threats and fights or vandalism at school, but there is no difference in the most serious type of violence, which is gangs, knives, and guns. So let's say that for the low type of violence, there is a big difference between the UK and the OECD average. For the most serious type of crimes or violence, there is actually no difference. Even the UK is slightly below. So this is not a question about gangs and knives and guns. It's a question about threats and fights. Sense of belonging in the UK, students report a little bit sense of belonging, a little bit lowest sense of belonging than the typical OECD country, and this is important because we see sense of belonging not only affects the way the well-being of students, affects the learning of students. Actually, we see a relationship between sense of belonging and a lot of variables and information and results and outcomes in education. So it is an important message. And we obviously prefer our students to feel attached to the schools than otherwise. Another key message, and one that the UK probably doesn't, in theory, I mean, doesn't look as nicely as for other outcomes, is how motivated students are when there was remote learning. 6 in 10 UK students reported that they lacked motivation to actually study by themselves, so self-directed learning. How motivated they were when they had to learn remotely. This is slightly above the OECD average, and it's something to consider. Not so much because we're not expecting to have a new pandemic in the near future. Who knows? But this is something interesting because we prefer our students to be able to learn by themselves. We're almost there. Five more slides. This is pre-primary school attendance and grade repetition. There is a clear relationship between students attending pre-primary education and the chance or the probability of repeating a grade. Obviously, students who attended pre-primary education are less likely to repeat a grade later on in their education. Now, this is not so relevant for the UK because grade repetition is actually very small in the UK. It's not a big topic. That's why I don't have too many slides about grade repetition, but it's obviously a huge topic in countries like France, Portugal, Spain, Belgium, or Colombia. This is another interesting and positive message about the UK. Well, by the way, pre-primary, I know the UK, all the 4 education systems have done a great work in increasing the percentage of students attending pre-primary. I know it's going down and down, so 5 and now 4 and then 2+. And then I don't know where we will go from there, but I know there's been a huge effort, and I think everything we have on this on pre-primary, it basically says it pays off, particularly to disadvantaged students. In terms of school autonomy, so to what extent schools are able to make decisions in different topics. I think the message for the UK is positive. If you see there on the right, that means there is a lot of school autonomy. Schools are able to make a lot of decisions and much more than the typical school in the OECD. This is for curriculum, which is probably the most relevant one. Actually, even public schools in the UK have more freedom or more autonomy to make decisions than some private schools in other countries. So this is a very positive message. Similar for resources, probably not as much. And this is an interesting message. We are comparing countries here. We're comparing countries at the top performing countries where the UK actually belongs, and low performing countries. And we see what is the school autonomy in these different countries. And we see that in top performing countries, decisions about human resources are typically made by the principal. In low-performing countries, these decisions are always made by the national authorities, national or regional authorities. And this is really important. I mean, obviously, there is no necessary causal relationship because I know the context in many middle-income countries, governments actually don't trust the schools, don't trust the teachers, and sometimes for a reason. Because there's no enough skills, because they are not able to design their own curriculum, because they're not able to design their own tests. So often when you give a lot of freedom to teachers in some countries, what happens is they just follow the textbook. No deviation from the textbook. Now the UK is in a position where you can actually delegate and you can give a lot of autonomy to schools because they would probably use it for good purposes. And the same for even more extreme for curriculum and assessment, and in this case is teachers. So in top-performing countries, teachers are the ones making the decisions on curriculum and assessment. And in low-performing countries is again the national or federal authority. This is a list of how different countries stratify. So the three indicators on stratification is grade repetition, so that is vertical stratification. There's ability grouping, so to what extent we create ability grouping within schools, and early tracking. And what we see here is that United Kingdom stands for being a comprehensive system. It's not using any of the three to a greater extent than on average across OECD countries. The only exception would be ability grouping for some classes. There is a lot of ability grouping for some classes in the UK, but not for all subjects. And the one that really matters and has a big impact in terms of equity is actually creating ability grouping for all classes. And that is typical a high school where you have class A is top performing students, class B is second, and then class D or E is the actually lowest performing. Those sort of ability grouping, at least in the data, is not typical in the UK. And this is the last question, private schooling. Well, the UK stands for having a lot of private schooling. This is obviously mainly government, private government dependent schools. So this is free academies and free schools. What we see in general is that private schools and public schools have very similar performance when we compare similar socioeconomic profiles. On average, private schools do better than public schools. Once you control for socioeconomic profile, there's actually no difference, and sometimes even public schools perform a little bit better than public schools, especially at the lower end of the distribution. If you look in this graph, you will see that public schools are actually outperforming public schools when the socioeconomic status of students is actually quite low. Once you go to the average, there's no difference. Once you go beyond the average, there are situations where private schools do a little bit better. But this is the case for the OECD in general. This is the case for the UK. What we see in the UK is that government-dependent private schools, there is differences between public and government-dependent private schools is actually quite small. Before or after accounting. And private independent schools do a little bit better than private independent schools on average across the OECD. So basically the results are very similar to the OECD, just that private schools do a little bit better in the UK, particularly private independent schools, than the typical private independent school across the OECD. This is how private and public schools reacted to COVID-19. The message, I'm going to summarize, the message is quite clear. Private schools were entered the pandemic better prepared than public schools by a big, there was a big difference across the OECD and in the UK. Once the pandemic hit, actually public schools did a great effort to catch up. Some of them actually did. And in the UK, you see very few differences once the pandemic actually struck. You see huge differences in the first wave, second wave, but progressively the differences in terms of how many students were attending classes, differences in terms of digital preparedness, there were actually no big differences between public schools and private schools after a couple of months or after a year after the pandemic actually hit. And this is just how education is changing. This is the last slide. So we're moving from routine cognitive skills to complex ways of thinking and working. We're moving from some students learning at high levels to everyone has to perform at high levels. Standardization and compliance. We're moving to high-level professional knowledge workers. And this is clear when you give a lot of autonomy to schools. This is why it's happening. We're moving from a tayloristic and industrial education models to flat, collegial, entrepreneurial, and we're moving primarily from authorities, primarily to peers and stakeholders. So this is a summary. I just would like to say sorry if I was too long, too boring. I did my best.
Thank you very much indeed, Alfonso. And I'd now like to ask the Minister of State for Schools, Damien Hines MP, to give his response.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Alfonso, for that exceptionally insightful presentation. I think there's an awful lot for everybody to to take in. It's also a massive undertaking, the 690,000 students that you mentioned, and a great asset to the world. Why do we care about international comparisons? Well, you know, when you visit schools, you see that motto quite often written up on the whiteboard: be the best you can be the best version of yourself, be the best you. Well, we should have that ambition also as a country, both in terms of the attainment of our children as a whole, but also in terms of narrowing that gap between the rich and the poor, trying to break the link between the parent's income and the child's outcome. And PISA acts as an objective yardstick of that. And any of us in public policy can believe our own narrative about how everything we're doing is brilliant. But with a study like this, you have to face up to how things are in other places that have made other choices. It also helps you to know where to learn from. Because in being the best you can be, you need to know what is possible, and you need to know how somebody else has done something. And if you accept that principle that talent is distributed equally, then it should be possible to take what happens in the best systems in the world and learn from them, as we did openly with looking at East Asia, for example, on mathematics. And ultimately, that is not just about nations competing against one another. It is about trying to do the best for our children, for them to reach their potential for social mobility and social justice and the prosperity and future of our society. And of course that becomes even more important when you face a situation like the aftermath of a global pandemic. And that clearly is a big theme of this year's PISA results. In much of the OECD, scores have fallen. COVID has set the world back, and that's concentrated in among disadvantaged students. England is no exception to that on both counts. The disadvantage gap in this country, in England, had reduced very significantly by 9% between 2010 and 2019. And we're now, of course, investing, as other countries are, in education recovery post-COVID. In our case, £5 billion, including £1 billion on tutoring, alongside, of course, the ongoing work with the pupil premium. We also know there's more to do in certain areas, particularly, and I think this is probably a challenge in many countries across the OECD, particularly on attendance post the pandemic. Now, there are data caveats to these results this year. It was an unusual time to be collecting data, harder to recruit students to take part, with response rates in a number of OECD countries, including the home nations, all the home nations, I think, here in the UK. But with that caveat, I think, ladies and gentlemen, there is good reason for optimism about education in England and the prospects of getting that disadvantage gap closing once again. England, as you saw on the slides, repeatedly a number of times, was among the highest performers in Europe and often further afield. And that mirrors, of course, other studies that we've seen, including the Pearl study on primary reading, where England was fourth out of 43 countries, the TIMS study in 2019, looking at mathematics among Year 5 pupils, where England reached its highest score ever. But one that really matters to us is what you said about equity, and that the OECD counts England among the 10, what you call, in that top quartile, the top right, the 10 equitable nations where, when it comes to loosening the link between socioeconomic status and the results that children get. Now, all of this work, of course, happens in schools. It doesn't happen in the Department for Education or in think tanks or in reports. It happens by what goes on in the classroom. It is done by teachers and leaders. And whenever you ask somebody about their own education, recent or a long time ago, what was good about your education, they never say it was a textbook or a scheme of works or a piece of education technology. They always talk about a person. They talk about that teacher that inspired them to stretch themselves, of maybe a subject they were struggling with, that they went on to study in higher education, or an exam they thought they couldn't possibly pass. or they were having difficulties at home or friendship problems at school. It is always about those people. But teachers, of course, also work within an ecosystem and a framework of curricula, of specifications, prevailing practice, professional development, what is tested and how it's tested, and so on. And progress in education, I think, comes from the combination of the two. It's great teachers supported by a really effective framework and system. And so while we continue to put attracting and retaining great teachers at the absolute top of the list, we've also been working consistently on reforming the system. And as this PISA cycle is particularly focused on mathematics, we'll have a quick look at what we've been doing there. We've overhauled both what's taught in maths and how to seek to emulate some of those highest performing countries, benchmarking the curriculum. So on primary, for example, a greater focus on written methods of arithmetic, and on secondary, more on algebra, on geometry and applications like statistics. On assessments, we have the statutory times tables checks now at year 4 to ensure pupils have really mastered those timetables, which, as everybody knows, comes up again and again and well into adult life, and a larger and more stretching maths GCSE. The Teaching for Mastery programme has transformed the way that maths is taught in primary schools, backed by, for many schools, backed by a national network of maths hubs, which aim to reach 3/4 of primary schools and 2/3 of secondary schools over the next couple of years. We also have a greater incentive now to enter mathematics teaching, the Advanced Mathematics Premium and more. And recently the Prime Minister set out his vision for the Advanced British Standard at the end of secondary education, which will include mathematics for all to the age of 18. Ladies and gentlemen, I spoke about the most important group of people alongside parents in bringing up children. They are teachers. System reform, though, is also about people. And maths reform is only part of a wider programme over 13 years in this country, from phonics to A-level reform, to school autonomy, to the way we measure pupil progress through Progress 8. And there is one individual who I think is most associated with that set of reforms, and I'm very pleased that he is here today. It is, of course, my colleague and friend, Nick Gibb. And a couple of years ago, when Nick was speaking at the a rival think tank, Social Market Foundation, he listed out the key objectives in education: an extensive and knowledge-rich curriculum by well-trained and supported teachers, with strong discipline for a safe and caring environment, where children are set high standards and high expectations, where success is rewarded and celebrated, and where schools develop their character and resilience. And he said, if every school delivers these, only then will we succeed in reducing the gap between children who come from backgrounds where the importance of education can sometimes take a backseat to the trials of everyday living, and those whose families have the time and ability to add to the education that their children receive at school. That encapsulates Nick's driving motivation over these years and his moral sense. But I think more widely, it also sets a very important standard for us all. There has been a huge amount achieved by pupils, teachers, leaders, support staff, everybody involved in education, with an awful lot of very hard work. But we are far from being able to say the job is done, and even more so with the disruption dealt by COVID. And while we cannot, sadly, make sure that every child has exactly the same opportunities at home, we must have that opportunity for when they come to school. And my job is to make sure that by the next PISA survey, our progress towards a fairer, more inclusive society is only going in one direction, and that continues to be forwards.
Thank you very much, Minister. And we now have two of the other key individuals within our education system who will give a few short remarks each before we open up to the floor for questions. So first, could I invite Amanda Spielman, His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Schools, to take the floor.
Thank you. It's a fascinating exercise, PISA, tremendously valuable for so many of us, and big thanks to all the people who've done so much to put this together. I know how much value it's going to have. Some really interesting things do jump out of this. I will try and avoid simply repeating anything that's been said before, but I've just got a few things I did want to talk about. The first is just quite how massive the COVID hit has been across the world. 3/4 of a year in maths, half a year in reading. That is huge and sends a very, very strong message about quite how important actual physical schools are. That however much we might like it if children were like the most motivated adults, so children are children, and the sort of very definition of a school is to be a place where children learn the things that they don't necessarily know they need to learn or don't necessarily yet have the motivation to learn. Schooling matters. Then on to the various points around equity. I was very pleased to see sort of how good we are, along with a handful of other countries, at integrating immigrants. Really sort of positive message for the future, I think. And more generally, the very strong messages, Alfonso, about system equity. I think that cuts against the narrative that is often discussed, and I think it is really important for us to reflect on and understand that there's a lot we're actually good at here. I thought it was a particularly interesting section that I don't think has been touched on, but I hope people will explore about different types of policy, where there's a very interesting categorization between what's described as disadvantage targeted policies and performance targeted policies, i.e. at low performers, sort of irrespective of socioeconomics. And if you look at that at both at the high performing countries, but specifically at the set of countries identified as both high performing and high equity, it's very clear that the skew in those countries is towards policies targeted at low performance rather than at policies directly targeted at students who are low on the socioeconomic scale. And I'm pulling this out because it's somewhat counterintuitive, I think, to many people to think that the best way to create equity isn't necessarily simply to channel resource directly at the subset of most disadvantaged students, that we may actually do better for them by approaching things in a slightly different way. Though this cropped up, some of this discussion cropped up in the context of the tutoring programme on whether it should be targeted primarily on students with from low-income families and other kinds of disadvantage, or whether it should be focused primarily on pupils who, for whatever reason, had fallen out of the sort of range of the current classroom, to get them back into range of the classroom teaching. I argued for the latter, but I understand the emotional pull of always directly targeting disadvantage, so I think it's very important to unpack that more. The last thing I wanted to touch on is science. Looking at the longer term trends for the UK, and obviously specifically for England, because my responsibilities don't extend beyond England. There's a real contrast, I think, over the last few years in the underlying trends on maths and reading and for science. And I think there were three significant policy decisions that have probably contributed to this. That the children taking PISA in this round had a significantly different experience from the children taking PISA 10 or 15 years ago. That they had been through education in a world where there weren't key stage 3 tests, where there weren't key stage 2 science tests, and where all subject level inspection had been removed from inspection, which is the other big lever. So there was the intersection of those policies created a sort of, I think, a significant de-emphasis of science relative to reading and maths, possibly also other parts of the curriculum. So really thinking about how the strategic levers in the system create the right incentives for the whole curriculum, not just for the tremendously important reading and maths, that there is more to education. And the very last point I'll make is, of course, this essentially focuses us on education up to the age of 16. There's lots to talk about that this doesn't cover on education post-16, but there's also very fertile ground there. But as I say, really valuable, so much that's positive coming out, really good for helping us, I think, focus over the next few years. I'll be handing over at the end of December to my successor, but I'm sure it's going to give him sort of real food for thought in making sure that we target our work appropriately. But many congratulations, I think, due to many, many students and many teachers and schools. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amanda. And our final speaker is Dame Rachel de Souza, the Children's Commissioner for England.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll be brief. I stand here in front of you as the daughter of an immigrant, a refugee, as someone who, like many of those children, every couple of weeks didn't have food, didn't have money for food, for lunch. And I want to wholeheartedly thank the teachers and head teachers of this country who have delivered a higher equity system and have rocket boosted those maths results. Can you believe we've beaten Poland? And as the daughter of an immigrant, I don't want to see the press tomorrow covered with negative, awful stories about immigration. I want to see them talking about how well our children have done, how we are rocket boosting up those tables. We've got more work to do, but we should take this one because given what we've been through, it is amazing. In 2009, what were we, 27th? And we're shooting up. And I reference back to that because this is not a story of quick wins. I became an academy principal dedicated to ensuring that disadvantaged children could do as well as any other children. Children at Eton could have the same educational outcomes and the same educational opportunities back in 2005. And was part of the reform process, you know, in 2010, when the passion and the focus went onto the evidence base, yes, changing the system, but also really working on what works, how do we improve maths, how do we improve English. I went with Elizabeth Truss on the first, remember that name, she was our children's minister back then. I went with her to China on one of the first trips, crazy trip from Shanghai to Beijing with Wuhan in between to look at mathematics. And the next year, Nick Gibb took over and really developed that the maths hubs and the work on phonics. And I just do want to pay testimony to him, actually, for the work on mathematics and the work on phonics, because if you can't read, you can't do maths. I want to garland him with flowers, knight him. He has genuinely, and what is so important about what he did and what he's done is that he was a sticker. He was a stayer. We were all, the profession, were working our socks off to raise standards and to improve, and taking that pressure of it has to be better, it has to be better. He was there, he was pushing and really working on that. If only, as Children's Commissioner, and I stand here to say, only we had had one children's minister who could work on the other side of reform, which is where I'm going next. But I think we have to truly praise what was done there, and thank you, Nick. I often didn't want to answer the phone, you know, but we did. I often would see things and think, oh God, how are we going to do that as a school leader? But you know, the results speak for themselves. But now to the so we're talking about a 13, a 20, a 25-year journey. We're talking about a long journey of education reform. The gap was narrowing. I believed, truly as a human being, I believed that education was the single most important thing to improving the life chances of children. I dedicated my life to it. We saw that gap narrowing. Just before the pandemic, it slowed down. The pandemic blew it apart. So we are now looking at what to do next when this gentleman comes again over the next few years. What can we do to actually narrow this gap? What situation are we in? And Damien mentioned some of the things I believe we really do have to do. Look, we have to keep the academic standards up. We have to do that, but we are not going to narrow this gap unless we truly appreciate the situation that the children in our country are in. First of all, we have to recognise the attendance crisis. We should be leading a national campaign to get our children back to school. We have to recognise also that is very different in different places and just what disadvantage looks like now. We have to invest in our services and refocus our services around children, around schools, particularly in the most disadvantaged areas. If I was that academy principal back in 2005, turning around schools with alacrity and getting the results up, I promise you, I could not do that same thing now and get the same results. We're going to have to go twice as hard and recognise that the need for services, the need for health to work with education, the need for local authorities to really deliver on the services, and the particular groups of children that we need to work on. It was so exciting for me to see those the great performance of immigrant children, obviously for my own reason. But you know, when I'm out talking to head teachers, that we've got truly disadvantaged groups now, like asylum-seeking children and children whose families are falling into poverty even though they're working, and we really need to rocket boost the support for them to enable them to engage with education. I tell you, as someone who missed my lunch, often didn't have bus money or lunch money, when you're hungry you can't learn. So I applaud the Breakfast Club model. We need it everywhere. We need to really focus in on giving the children what they need in the most disadvantaged areas. And when I talk to children, I want to end on a positive, because these results, I think also what these results shouted at me was family, engagement with the family. We need that to resolve the attendance crisis. We need that to ensure this generation of parents understand how important going to school is for your outcomes and for your life chances. You might all sit there and think it's a given. That head teachers are telling me around the country that parents are now talking to them about, why should I go to school? Why do I need to be on time? We need to address that full on and sort that out. I want to give the last words to the children. When I came into post, I did the Big Ask, talked to 500,000 children, biggest survey of children ever. The problems they were talking to me about then were getting back to school, catch up, about mental health concerns, anxieties and worries. And actually the government response to those in terms of really trying to support catch up, you know, with tutoring and that, we can see the evidence of that. I'm out doing the big ambition now, asking the children of this country, what do you want? There's going to be an election. What do you want the Prime Minister to know? So when that new Prime Minister's first day, what do you want them to know? They're talking to me about, back post-pandemic, it was, we love our teachers, we want to get back to school, we're a bit nervous about it, you know, we're worried about this. Now, from Exeter to Plymouth to right around this country, children are talking to me about safety, about violence on the streets. They're talking to me about desperate desire to do well in education. They're talking to me about their ambition for their futures. We have no lack of ambition in our children, and we now need to get round them, support their parents to get them into school so this fantastic education we're talking about can be delivered. I do think, and I'm going to throw this one in, I would like to see more vocational from age 14, but I'd love to see what PISA has to say about that, because I think I am seeing a group of students who really would need that, but a knowledge-rich vocational minister, of course, and absolutely the maths and English and the science have been fantastic. So thank you so much. It is great. Let's be proud. Let's be proud of what our children have achieved. Let's thank Nick Gibb. Let's keep this rocket boost going forward, but let's do the things that will enable our children to succeed now. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm very pleased we will be hearing from Nick himself in just a very short period of time. Before we do, I think we have time for one quick round of questions from the floor. Journalists, we are having a separate press conference afterwards with the Minister and with Alfonso. So I will cast it out wider to anyone else in the room who has questions. Yes. I'll take a couple at a time.
Dame Rachel Souza, you mentioned the attendance crisis,
Yes.
and it seems that unless something is done about it, have a severe impact on these kind of results going forward and our ability to bounce back. And you also alluded to the fact that at the heart of this seems to be a change in parents' belief about the importance of attending school and also the relationship between, there also some evidence is the relationship between parents and schools. So to the whole panel, and that's quite a complex challenge then. What could be done to kind of to tackle that challenge, to kind of bring parents back on board and to reinforce the idea that physical attendance at school is absolutely crucial?
Thank you. And do we have one other question from anyone? Nick in the front.
Thank you. It was a really, really great session. I wondered if I could ask a bit more about gender. I mean, you had boys, for example, falling behind even in maths now in some countries, and there have been some quite wild ideas over the last year or so about things we might do to help boys in education, like they start school a year later than girls, so they don't get put off learning early, things like that. And I wondered if you could just say a bit more about the OECD's views on how to equalise outcomes by gender.
And I'll take one last question here, Alice at the front, and then we'll go to our panel.
Thank you. Just picking up again on the point of parental engagement, one of the things that struck me quite a lot about the PISA report was the importance of parents engaging in learning. I think that's something that predates the pandemic. So what kind of solutions can we see from other PISA countries where they've got that right?
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got 3 questions there. One about parental engagement, one about attendance, and one about gender. And we'll go in reverse order this time. So Rachel, please feel free to address any one or a couple of the questions as you see fit.
Okay, so look, I think there is a real, both in government and across the profession, there is a real understanding that we need to address, really need to put this attendance crisis front and centre. I think the point about it being a nuanced problem is absolutely right. So if you look at those 1.8 million persistent absent figures, some of them are Monday, Friday absent, and really sort of and speak to the need for us really engaging with parents about, why it's important to attend every day. Now, I'm going to tell you why. I've just analysed last year's Year 11 results. If you missed 50% of your schooling last year, you had only 5% of those children got 5 good grades, including maths and English. If you were persistently absent and missed 10%, 38% of you did, compared to 78, 80% of the rest of the cohort. But, and this is the most important but, if in year 10, if you'd been absent, all of year 10, persistently absent, and you turned it round in year 11, you absolutely were one of the 80%. So that's hopeful. There is something we can do about it. So we need to be, to my mind, running a national campaign led by our leaders, really saying why school is important. We have to make the case again, the world has changed. We also, I believe, and this won't get the number down as much, but it will probably deal with our most difficult cases, those severe absent students, those 100,000 or so students who are falling off the radar. That isn't about parental engagement. That's about, when we look at that, that's your mental health group, it's your special educational needs group, it's your group who have just, are at risk of criminal exploitation, have just dropped off the radar. That needs sustained multi-agency local work. I've been asked by the Attendance Alliance by Nick and others to actually start forming and working with some of those local groups, because we need all partners playing: education, health, youth justice, everyone. So that's kind of, they've got to move on, but that's the attendance answer.
Brilliant, thank you, Rachel. And Amanda.
Yeah. On attendance, Rachel said it, but there is a tremendous coordinated effort going on already. I think our work shows that the vast majority of schools are working hard and systematically. Bringing health into the picture and other services is really helpful. I hope that we will see reducing pressure on the external health and special needs and other services that schools rely on. That will undoubtedly help. But the social contract did get severely damaged. Whether we like it or not, it's going to take time to rebuild. And I think it's very important for people to understand that there aren't magic bullets. This is going to be many years of sustained work. And the parental engagement piece, again, I don't think there are magic bullets. actually a tremendous amount of parental engagement work did happen through COVID to get learning to pupils in all sorts of ways. Parents actually in some ways had more visibility of their children's education when they were being taught remotely. Mostly for good, occasionally some surprises, but I think that also is not a magic bullet. That higher level of engagement hasn't necessarily sustained into a higher level of support for education post-pandemic. So again, just sort of the continued effort, and there are clearly cultural differences, quite deep cultural differences between societies. So we're probably getting into the place where it's a little bit dangerous just to go cherry picking among different policies and cultures internationally, where you're getting into deep characteristics. And Nick, you asked a very interesting question about gender. Yeah, we've barely scratched the surface of that today, but I think it's a really important one to explore further. Alfonso, you made that point about the sort of the different distribution profiles of the girls being sort of more tightly grouped than boys. I think it's one of those things where gap analysis tends to serve us poorly, because depending on where you cut your distribution, you get a different gap between boys and girls. So really going more deeply into that and thinking about, excuse me, as has been happening for many years actually, about thinking about the participation of girls from the points that we introduce choice and choice into the system. So one of my long-standing concerns has been simply the impact of giving girls more points that they can opt out, for example, of maths and science, and the impact it has, particularly post-16 actually, which we're not touching on today. But it is a really important agenda.
Thank you. Minister, I was going to allow you to have the last word, if that's okay, and skip to Alfonso first. And I wonder if I could direct you particularly towards the gender question,
yes.
As you will have seen many countries.
Yes, so the gender question, I think we're all kind of learning about this because we focused so much on girls in the last decades, and it's still probably true in middle-income countries. Actually, we wrote a report like 6-7 years ago, and it was more about girls than about boys. Once we were actually thinking and analyzing the data, we realized actually this is more about boys than about girls. So the story about girls was basically self-confidence. They were lacking self-confidence even with the same kind of skills. But with boys, we found so many more problems. We found problems of low performance, low motivation, a lot of video gaming, mismatch between what teachers were actually expecting, mostly female teachers and boys. So a lack of, and actually the differences we observe here are actually trivial. I mean, compared to actually graduation rates and grades at school, the difference are actually, in terms of skills, the difference are not as large. When we actually look at graduation, or we look at the early school leaving, or we look at grades in particular, the difference between boys and girls are actually huge, much higher than here. Actually, when we go to skills, it actually balances. The other issue is that once they're 25 or 30, many of these gaps actually disappear. So probably that's one of the reasons why still some scholars, policymakers are not as concerned, because we know with PIAC that by age 25-30, some of these gaps have actually disappeared. This is a special time. It's 15-year-olds, adolescents. We know girls mature faster. But still, I think there's many things to be done in terms of, especially reading. I mean, I think the focus is on reading. Try to ensure that actually boys read more, maybe different type of reading that applies more to their daily lives. But we know that boys don't engage in reading. They don't enjoy reading as compared to girls. So I think that the focus is probably more on reading, and lack of motivation sometimes just disappear or improves as they actually grow, and mature. And in terms of parents, just one thing. I think we're in a tricky situation where parents are becoming more supportive. They actually are able to teach their children way better than they did 40, 50 years ago. But at the same time, they're actually extremely demanding on schools, on teachers. So we have these complex relations between schools where they can actually trust or rely on parents, but at the same time, parents are actually pushing schools or demanding schools much more than before. What we see in PISA is, in general, parents contribute a lot when they're actually do daily activities that are not necessarily instrumental and educationally related. So just talking to children, having dinner with children, being supportive, all those things that are not so instrumental, not so obvious, those are the things that are signs of a good parent-teacher-student relationship. And just one thing, life satisfaction, the most strongly associated aspect of students' life for life satisfaction is their relationship with their parents. Second one is school life. So parents' school life. So just obviously, if you don't get right the first one, it's unlikely that you will actually do really well at school if the first one is actually not working well.
Thank you very much. And Minister,
thank you.
final word is yours.
So I think what's supposed to happen here is I say, well, Amanda and Rachel said so much about attendance, I'll talk about something else. But I'm going to talk about attendance because it is so incredibly important. We talk often, it came up again today, about early reading, and if you can't read, you can't access the rest of the curriculum. Same thing with attendance. If you're not in school, all these other great things that teachers and leaders and school staff are doing cannot have a beneficial effect on you. And you can, as the Children's Commissioner said, you can track it right through to results. You can put a cash value on it in terms of the investment that is being made in your education that you are foregoing. It has an effect on other children in the class and the pace at which the class can proceed. And of course, just as a young person, as a child, the things you miss out on in your friendship groups and sport and all the other things that go at school. It is a complex subject. And the important thing to say is persistent absence had come down. This is a COVID effect again, and it is a complex phenomenon. There are different factors involved, but a couple of them are really quite health related. First of all, a different attitude to if my child has really quite mild symptoms of a cold, say, the threshold at which I would say I'm going to keep them home rather than send them to school. And the second is about children's anxiety about going to school. And I think it's really important that we get the message out that actually, generally speaking, you are better being in school. Obviously, there is a level of illness and so on where you don't go to school, but with mild illness, generally speaking, it is better to be there. And with anxiety, actually, again, there are different degrees of anxiety and so on, but generally speaking, with mild anxiety, if you're off school, you're going to get more anxious about going back to school and all the routine and the friendships and everything else that goes with humanity. Is helpful rather than harmful. I should also say some schools are doing an absolutely phenomenal job on this, and already just in the short time I've been back at the Department for Education, I've met schools who are going above and beyond, phoning up within a couple of hours or 1 hour of the start of school, and visiting at home. Obviously that is a lot of hard work, and you can't keep on doing it. You can't keep on doing it indefinitely. But I really pay massive tribute to what schools are doing. We're also trying to spread best practice through a kind of hub and spoke network of what's best practice on attendance. But fundamentally, it's a hearts and minds question, and we are going to be doing more on this. I'd also look to our friends in the media that it's a really important message. Sometimes these things come better from other sources or backed up by other sources, that it really, really is so important for our children and young people as they're growing up, as they're developing, as they're becoming adults, as they're learning to be in school.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted that you put that focus on attendance, and hope you continue to do so throughout your time as Minister. I'd like to thank you to all our speakers, but the person who's going to be saying thank you here is Nick Gibb, who we're delighted to have joining us today. As Rachel has already showered praise on him, but he has lived and breathed this for the last 13 years. As Minister for Schools for more than 10 of those years, he's visited over 1,000 schools, and he has managed to shift a public service system which educates over 8 million people who are in it, who are our children. And shifting a system that big is not easy, but Nick is one of the few people who can say he's done it. So Nick, please come up.
Well, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, the panel. Can I just first of all start by saying thank you to PolitiXchange for hosting the PISA announcement today. Other venues were suggested to me, but I wanted it to be here because of your record of contributing to the reform programme that we've implemented over the last 13 years. Your reports, particularly about the importance of autonomy, were very, very critical in setting the policy framework that we, and Michael Gove and I and others, introduced from 2010 onwards. So thank you to you and everyone at Policy Exchange. Can I also thank the OECD and PISA. Alfonso, thank you for being here and announcing these results. These international surveys are hugely important. We looked at those surveys in our years in opposition. We were worried about the decline of the UK and England in those years of opposition, and we learned from them. And we identified from your surveys who were the top performers. And so we looked to Singapore as the basis of our reforms to the primary maths curriculum. We took the 2007 curriculum and then we consulted and adapted it to these circumstances of our country, and that formed the basis of very major reforms to our primary maths curriculum. I went to Hong Kong to see what was happening in the way maths is taught in Hong Kong, and I went to Shanghai as well, following the visit that you and Elizabeth, this trust, made to Shanghai as well, and learned from how they teach mathematics in those Far Eastern countries. In Hong Kong and in Shanghai, they are 2 years ahead of our youngsters in this country. And they take a very systematic approach to teaching the algorithms of the arithmetic. And they emphasize practice, but also a deep understanding of what those algorithms represent. And we had those teacher exchanges. We took that practice, and through the maths hubs that Damien referred to, schools teaching other schools, we've spread that best practice. And now you will see that East Asian mastery approach happening in most primary schools around the country. We reformed the primary curriculum. It was ready by 2013. It became compulsory in 2014. And then we had the first SATs in the new maths, more demanding maths curriculum in primary schools in 2016. There was a drop, of course, in the results because of that. It was more demanding. But then over the years following 2016, it went up and up in our primary schools. The third group I'd like to thank are our teachers. Tens of thousands of maths teachers, primary school teachers around the country have embraced and adopted our reform programme in schools, as well as adapting to the new, more demanding primary maths curriculum. They also adapted to the mathematics multiplication tables check that we piloted over many years, that became compulsory last year after many years of being tested, because it's a computer-based system. And last year, 27% of youngsters, these are 9-year-olds, achieved full marks with an average score of just under 20 out of 25 correctly answered questions. This year it was 29% reaching full marks, and the average score increased slightly as well, I think to 20.2. To thank the teachers for adapting to the new, more demanding GCSE maths that we also introduced. And I was worried about that, to be frank, when we introduced the maths GCSE, because it was very demanding. And I feared that it would lead to a drop-off of young people wanting to take A-level maths. In fact, because it's a much better preparation for A-level, we now have record numbers taking A-level maths. It's the single most popular A-level choice in the sixth form, and I think that is partly due to the better preparation that youngsters are receiving at GCSE. One of the things that I was interested in your report, Alfonso, was the issue of autonomy. And this is something I think that is important in our school reforms. And one of the things I'm most proud of, actually, is, if you like, freeing the profession to engage in the debate about pedagogy and curriculum, entering the secret garden in a way that really doesn't happen, hadn't happened here. And when you speak to other educationists from around the world, for example, Ben Riley from Deans for Impact from the States, he will say that in this country we are unique in the way that the teaching profession has now engaged in these debates in a way that didn't happen before and hasn't happened and isn't happening to the same extent in other countries around the world. And if you think about all the people that blog, the teachers that blog, you think about conferences that have been established, like Research Ed, run by Tom Bennett. 1,000 teachers will turn up on a wet Saturday in a school somewhere in the country and listen to other people talking about evidence-led education policies. It is a phenomenal success in this country, and because of that, I'm confident that our education reforms are here to last. And I think we can be confident that in future PISA results, our scores will continue to improve as we recover from COVID. and I thank you very much to the teaching profession for everything they've achieved. And finally, I would just like to say thank you to everybody here for joining in the celebrations of this country, England, going from 17th to 11th in maths. It's a great achievement for our country, it's a great achievement for our teachers and our education system and our 15-year-olds. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, the public part of the event is now concluded. We have tea and coffee at the back, but before people move, if I could ask journalists to head through the door there into the boardroom, where we will be having a short conference, and the Minister and Alfonso will be following them. Those of you, and I know there are a few, we have a private event, a private lunch afterwards. Please stay here and someone will come and collect you after the press conference is over. Thank you very much indeed.